This is the English language section of Free Radio Europe, a European voice in your home. Welcome from the seat of the European Parliament in Brussels on a truly historic day on which the President of Free Ukraine addressed us in a moving speech. We were just so delighted to see him physically safe and among us, and to be able to pledge to him to do whatever it takes for Ukraine to win its defensive war against Russian aggression. And to discuss matters to do with Ukraine, I couldn't have a better guest today than Lady Ashton of Poland. You have been the leader of the House of Lords, British Commissioner for Trade, and you're now the Chancellor of the University of Warwick. And you have published a book. And then what? Ladies and gentlemen, I really recommend you this book. This is not some thick brick with the record of all the conferences and all the meetings. This is a really good read. I'm, of course, biased because I'm in it. But I'd just like to congratulate you. It's not only personal and tells the story in a lively manner, but also quite brilliant in which it portrays the chaos of political decision-making and the chaos of an international media crisis. Let's start with this. How did you manage to remember so much lively detail?
So thank you, Radek. It's really kind of you to say this. And yes, indeed, you are in the book with good reason. And it all began because I didn't keep a diary. You remember those days. We were all flying across the world all the time. There wasn't time to sit down and collect your thoughts.
Your schedule is just amazing.
It was amazing. And when I finally would get home to London from time to time, my husband, who was a journalist, would put a tape recorder on, and over coffee or a glass of wine, he would say, "So just tell me, what did it feel like?" So this was not him getting the kind of detail you would get in a press report. It was him colouring in the black and white outline with what we were thinking, what we were doing, the jokes we might have had, and the real intensity of negotiations and of crises, of trying to pull it all together. So it's based on the tape recordings that he gave to me at the end of my 5 years and said, "Over to you."
The description of the mechanics of these international appointments is also excellent, because people think that it's all an orderly process, that you lobby for it and so on. Whereas you just learned, right, later today you'll be in Brussels, you're the new commissioner. And then you also found that to become high rep, it was all done basically behind your back, or rather at the prime ministerial level, right?
That's right. I mean, if you believe in public service, and you do and I do, then in a sense you put yourself into the position where when asked to serve, you serve. And so sometimes the individual in the middle of all that gets a bit lost in the process. So especially on something as complicated as putting together the puzzle of who's going to do which job in the new European Commission, and of course in the context then of the Lisbon Treaty, you're the pawn that gets moved around. And so twice in the book I describe things happening to me rather than me feeling involved in them.
And your difficulty was even bigger than the normal international appointment, because actually there was no institution to which you were appointed. You had to create it from scratch.
I did. And there were two things that I recall, and the way I describe it is that when people are thinking about a new job, in their mind, they have a picture of the person. It's like you read the book, you see the movie, and if the person in the movie doesn't look like the person in the book, then you're kind of a bit disappointed. And I certainly, for many people, did not look like the person they'd expected to see appointed. And then there's one line in the Lisbon Treaty that says this new role is going to be supported by European External Action Service, but it wasn't there yet. So the first job really was to try and create that.
But let's explain to people what I mean. You had no building, you had no staff, you had no regulations underneath the treaty fulfilling the...
And we had no money. So everything that we did at the beginning, you know, when I talk about the earthquake in Haiti in the book, when that happened, I didn't have a television in my room. You know, we had literally to kind of pull together resources, which, the Commission supplied some, we got some from elsewhere.
As far as I remember, not everybody in the Commission was so forthcoming with the resources.
You know, when you have an idea that's been 10 years in the kind of cooking, which was this idea of a kind of high representative that would pull three jobs together, by the time you get to it, a lot of the people who thought up the idea have long gone on to other things. And so I recall meeting lots of people in those early days who weren't at all sure that this is what should happen and weren't sure what it meant for them. And that was true of some of our colleagues in the Foreign Affairs Council too. Was this somebody who was going to take away that role? I hope I never, ever gave that impression, but I understand why people thought that, and so too with the institutions.
And so you had to create the institution while at the same time deal with the crises that just wouldn't wait. And the first one was Somalia, Horn of Africa and piracy. And we've discussed this before. Not everybody knows that you took the political responsibility for a military strike. People haven't known until recently that the EU does military stuff. And you took the responsibility for a strike on the pirates, as a result of which the rate of piracy in the Horn of Africa declined.
That's right. I mean, it was really the first major issue. It seems like a very long time ago, and for many of the viewers, they probably don't even know about it. But piracy was creating havoc for trade and for the World Food Programme.
Hostages.
They had hostages. It was unsafe across this huge ocean to actually travel and to do any kind of commercial or any other kind of activity. So we were creating corridors to help shipping get through and help the World Food Programme particularly. And then the question came, how do we really tackle it beyond arresting pirates at sea, beyond the obvious things you can do? And it was proposed that actually we could take out the boats. And you can only do it once, because after that they were not going to leave
unguarded.
them. Right, they weren't going to leave them unguarded. And I was fearful that so many of the pirates were very young men that they would be put to, told to go and sleep in a boat or whatever. And there were hostages too, as you rightly say. So the decision was taken. I didn't make the military decision. The experts, the military commanders and the admiral in charge took the decision. But on
the details, but you took the responsibility.
Yeah, the political responsibility, and you know this very well, has to lie somewhere. And in this case, it lay with me.
And if it went badly, we have no doubt who would get the blame.
We've no doubt it would be my responsibility to take responsibility, and I would have done. But it was an important moment, because it also showed that we could work together to take action. It was a one-off, and it worked.
You dealt with the natural disasters, Haiti, Japan, and then the Arab Spring, which was about people in the Arab world wanting our values, and it was in our interest to help them where they lived rather than them coming across the sea. And you went to Libya, and you tried to help the situation along in Egypt. Your descriptions of meeting the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood President Morsi, both while he was not being a very good president and then in custody, I found those particularly interesting.
It was a really interesting time, because we weren't sure always what we were looking at. You could see demonstrations happen, lots of people taking to the streets, but not organised. There were no stages and there were no people making speeches. They were mainly just groups of people coming together, but huge numbers. And of course it was spreading, that there were many countries caught up. Tunisia, where it began, Egypt, Libya, you saw demonstrations in many parts of that part of the world. And it was important that on the one hand we supported the desire for people, as a young man in Libya put it to me, to have what we have, democracy and freedom as a way of life. But it was also important to do it in a way that would calm the situation and help them move on, to kind of move from revolution to evolution, in a way. And in the course of this, the election of Morsi happened. He was not only not a very good president, but I think in many ways took the country in the wrong direction. And my last conversation with him before he was taken away was, it's not enough to be elected, it's what you do with it. And I still believe that. It's really important that leadership doesn't end when you get elected. It really begins.
But also, if you're a politician, you shouldn't just want to be something. I mean, you have to have a kind of mental map in your head of what you want to do with the power and the responsibility that is given to you.
That's right.
Otherwise, you're useless.
And it's also not about you. It's about who you serve. You know, public service is service. It is about saying, I'm here to serve you. You stand on a platform, you put forward your ideas, you have, if you like, the right to kind of try and implement those ideas. But you're always, always beholden to the people. It's for them that you're working. And I'm afraid, as we all know, too often in the world, you see that's not really what people have in mind. So they're either working for themselves or they're doing nothing, because to do anything, to make decisions, to show leadership is to take risk. And that's really tough.
I was very glad to read your very fair account of the split that we had in the European Council on Libya. If you remember, France, President Sarkozy was very determined to act. David Cameron kind of tagged along, but there were many of us who had serious doubts. Carl Bildt and I, Guido Westerwelle, even instructed the German ambassador at the UN to abstain. Yes. You clarified in my mind about the Russian attitude, because the Russians have argued about this ever since, that they were cheated, that they didn't know what they were signing up to. And you quite convincingly say that A, they knew, and B, the Arab League wanted us to do it. And that's what weighed on us and on them at the time. It was seen as the right thing to do.
That's right. I mean, I try and describe the issue of, you know, what is a no-fly zone? Because it struck me very quickly that there were so many different definitions.
Some people think it's just an announcement.
It's an announcement. It's a nice thing, you just say.
You mustn't fly.
You mustn't fly, that's it. But of course, if you talk to any of the military commanders, they will say it's a very clear act of determination, and you must be prepared to act if somebody does fly. So how do you prevent
for your
that?
planes to be able to fly securely, you should, in fact, destroy the radars and the anti-aircraft defenses of your adversary.
Exactly. That's what many of them would say was included in that phrase, and also the runways. I mean, lots of, if you like, aggressive acts can be part of the interpretation. And that was a whole set of discussions and negotiations. And there were concerns that although there was a genuine desire from everyone that the people of Benghazi, who are the people that we thought Gaddafi was going to attack, should be supported and helped. It's back to the name of the book, and then what? There was a sense that this was also going to send lots of different messages, not just in Libya but elsewhere, and it was going to make, in a sense, the move to remove Gaddafi a clear part of what this was all about. And though that was a desirable outcome, it was a big shift in the thinking. But in terms of what was going on at the Security Council, which is where ultimately it all had to go, the Russians knew what had happened, what the discussions had been, and the Arab League were absolutely determined that this was something they needed.
Issued an official request for us to act.
They did. And I went to see them in Cairo to talk about that. And that was a very, very clear message to everyone.
We discussed this before. My friend and mentor Zbigniew Brzezinski once said that you are never thanked for a crisis you prevent. So we went into Libya, and it didn't unfold as well as some people had hoped. But imagine if we hadn't, and Gaddafi massacred Benghazi, like we allowed, like Rwanda was massacred. And then there would have been recriminations, you know, one battalion could have prevented genocide. And here, you know, a few sorties could have prevented Gaddafi. You just don't know where these forks in the road will lead you, huh?
That's right. And that's the point, really, is that there were lots of reservations about what would happen afterwards, what was linked into the basic proposition that people got behind, which was we cannot let these people suffer. It's what comes afterwards that I'm also trying to explore in the book, in saying, you know, you need to think longer term about what we have to do and how long we have to stay. And one of the difficulties about Libya was that there was never really a government afterwards who could give us the authority to do what we could do. People said, well, the EU didn't do enough. My goodness, we tried. We wanted to put missions in that would secure the borders. We wanted to help them not be
They didn't want our troops, boots on the ground.
They did not want boots on the ground. We couldn't put police officers or customs officials in without protection and without the say-so of a government. Otherwise, it's a kind of invasion.
Sure.
So therefore, if you can't get that, you can't act. And I remember talking with the UN people on the ground, being in Tripoli, trying to get the permissions we needed, trying to get the agreement, trying to get the government to act. They didn't feel at that point they had the democratic legitimacy to do it, but that meant the country spiralled.
Your story of the Iran nuclear negotiations is in-depth and particularly exciting. Why did you think that as an infidel woman that they wouldn't even shake hands with you could succeed?
I took the not shaking hands actually for what it was, which was a mark of respect for a woman who was not part of their family. And they treated me with enormous respect because, of course, in Iran, women have access to great education. Many of them are professors in universities. They run their businesses.
It's not a totalitarian society.
It's a very
repressive society.
It's a repressive society. But if you look at it, and if you see what's been happening, as we've all been watching in recent times,
horrible.
The women are absolutely determined on having say over their own future. So they might not be in the political class, but my goodness, they're everywhere else and they're very active. And that's incredibly important. So when I was working with the Iranians, they were used to dealing with women in senior positions. Mine was a little bit different. And I was British, which was, of course, quite interesting. But I was there for Europe. And those particular Iranian negotiators were working on behalf of President Rouhani, who had come into power on the promise of a stronger economy. And that meant
fixing the relationship with the West.
Fixing the relationship, sorting out the sanctions.
There was, of course, a back channel between Iran and the United States. But there are these delicious descriptions of other foreign ministers crowding in not to miss the photo opportunity in case there is a deal.
It's always a problem, you know, when... And again, you will remember this well and know this well, that sometimes the photo is the thing that people need. I learned that in my 5 years, that sometimes I just had to be somewhere, so there was a photograph. I wasn't particularly making best use of my time. I wasn't necessarily doing the right thing in terms of where else I might have been. But you need to be there because it's an important statement. And for ministers who have left the negotiations primarily to the right people, the technical experts and the people who are week in and week out doing the work, that was the right thing to do. But occasionally, and particularly when we needed the Americans in situ to come along, they also had to come too.
The nuclear deal dealt with what Israel regarded as the most urgent threat to their national security, but it didn't deal with all the other issues between Iran and the West and Israel, which was ultimately its undoing, wasn't it?
I'm not sure that was its undoing in reality in terms of the US position.
Plus partisanship in the US, huh?
It was, I think, for the US, it was a combination that people felt that, some people felt, that for Iran to have any kind of nuclear activity was wrong. There were people who felt... Even
though by treaty they are entitled to a civilian nuclear program.
Exactly. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which they are a signatory, they are, in certain conditions. And we were creating those conditions. Others felt that it didn't go far enough. And for others, they thought that by doing this kind of agreement, we had emboldened Iran.
Well, some people thought that that the deal froze the nuclear program for a decade, thus giving Iran time, a decade, to develop the missile program, so that they can then restart it and have a missile and the warhead on top of it.
It assumes, though, that nothing else was going to happen.
Right.
Deal, done, finished. And that's not what was going to happen, or not what I planned would happen, and I think others would agree with it, it was only ever meant to be the first agreement, not the last. There was plenty more to do on missiles, on human rights, on other things, where there was an opportunity, because we built on an agreement, to be able to carry on discussing and talking and so on. Maybe not the same group. Obviously, for issues that affected the region had to take the lead, but certainly for others to be able to have those discussions. And we always had the ability to put back sanctions and use the pressure if things
But we
didn't go
released
well.
a lot of money to them.
We released a lot of money that was tied up in the sanctions. And the argument that people made was, you've given them lots of money to do things. Well, of course, the thing is, if you do a deal, if you're hanging on to their money, you've got to give it back. Or if there's money that should have been given to them, that's how it works.
It's tough, huh?
But it's only in the context of assuming that nothing else was going to happen. And for me, getting rid of what we feared could be only months away was really important. And doing it for long enough, with enough certainty, that allowed us to carry on doing work in that area.
I was on balance a supporter of the deal because I felt that the trajectory of Iranian politics was going slightly towards reform, and instead of enriching, they were diluted their uranium.
Yeah.
And now it's the other way around, and it's worse.
Yeah, that's right. And it shows the fact that the deal was incredibly important. And if we'd had the deal and stuck with the deal, then there was a chance that things would have been very different. We don't know quite where it would have gone. We can't predict. But certainly the deal was a good basis upon which to move forward. And I do regret that we didn't stay with it.
We both went to the inauguration of a controversial winner of a democratic election in Ukraine, President Yanukovych. Do you remember?
I do.
Together with President Lech Kaczynski at the time. As Prime Minister, he had a record of actually improving relations with the EU. And then it all went horribly wrong, huh?
Well, he'd stood on a platform of this association agreement from which all of this stems.
Closed under the Polish presidency of the EU in 2011.
Thank you for reminding me. A really important agreement that both economically and arguably politically brought them closer to Europe and to
Which is what
our
the
way of
Russians
life.
didn't want.
Which is what the Russians didn't want, but was certainly the platform upon which the president of Ukraine had been elected. This is about democracy and about the role that he was supposed to play in taking his country forward.
And then at the last minute, he drew back under blackmail and economic pressure from Putin.
When I went to see him, and I described this in the book and talked with him for hours, it was very clear.
I'm sure it was mostly he who was talking,
It was
from my experience.
It was certainly mostly he who was talking. Occasionally, there would be a moment. But nonetheless, you know, sometimes when people talk at great, great length, you do get an insight into what's going on that you might otherwise not have got. And it was very clear to me that he had, in a sense, overstepped his mark with the Russians, that he was clear that he couldn't move forward with this deal. And he kept saying he would sign it in the future, and Radek, I knew he wouldn't.
He shredded his presidency at that moment. If he'd signed, he would have become the leader of Ukrainian nation in their march towards Europe, and they might even have, to some extent, forgiven his thieving.
Yeah, I think there was a possibility, because the agreement was initialed, you know, that point when it's all done and ready to go. Yeah. All it required was his signature. And I wonder sometimes whether he just thought that with all that was going on, maybe we would be the ones who wouldn't sign it and he wouldn't have to worry.
And then Euromaidan started with the protests against his not signing the agreement.
Exactly right. And people stood with EU flags. So when I went
800,000.
Yeah, and when I went there, I said to him, I'm going from here to Maidan because these people have EU flags. I want to know what's happening and who they are. And it was people from every walk of life. It was families, it was journalists, it was activists, it was young people, it was older people, all there to make the point that this was the direction they wanted to go.
And then Yanukovych starts shooting, at which point you allow me to put together the group of Weimar Triangle ministers, Germany and France, and we, with your support, we put together an agreement between him and the opposition. And, you know, it was while we were negotiating it through the night that I realized how well the soft power of the EU works. You know, the EU ambassador in Kiev, as you know, was a Polish diplomat,
Yes.
Tombinski, and he would tell me, and the Foreign Affairs Council was meeting in parallel, so he would tell me, you know, we're going to get there because all the high officials are approaching him saying, but you're not going to sanction me, are you?
Right. Absolutely right. And it's that combination, isn't it, that I really believe in, which is a kind of dialogue, keep talking, keep, you know...
But carry a stick.
And pressure. I mean, pressure that you can put on in different ways, sometimes positive pressure. The pull of the EU is a positive pressure to try and make things change. But occasionally it also requires that you're prepared to put pressure to sanction, to act, and to be determined about the things that we believe in. That's so important as well. I
still feel that we should have been tougher and show more solidarity with Ukraine earlier on. Because Putin may have misread our signals. Already in 2013, when he started a boycott of Ukrainian goods, and we basically left Ukraine to their own devices at that time. That I felt was our mistake as the Foreign Affairs Council, despite my best efforts, if I may say so.
Absolutely right. And it's not because people, in many cases, it's not about being weak or about not wanting to do something, but you know that when you're in those situations, it's often hard to know what it is that's really going on.
You're dealing with, yeah.
And from your perspective, I think one of the great things about the EU, and I say this as a Brit who sadly we're not here anymore, but was that the expertise and knowledge and experience around the table meant that there were people like yourself and countries like yours that really understood what we were looking at much, much better. And the challenge is how you build that into a strong, determined approach where everybody is part of it. We look back now and you can see the direction, but I was still surprised by what happened a year ago.
Last word, any advice for your successors?
I think it's a really hard job. It's really difficult to kind of build on all of the desires of the different member states and the institutions and to try and pull a programme together. The most valuable thing you've got is your time, because there's only one of you. So my advice is always make the plan as far as you can. Remember that things need to be thought about in the long term, long after you've gone out of office. We need to still be determined to try and help.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your book. Please read it. It's apart from anything, a really good read. This has been the English language section of Free Radio Europe. Lady Ashton, thank you.
Radek, thank you.
See you next time.